spending and tax plans, let's start by examining one of the central claims of Mr. Osborne's budget speech, that we're now better off than we were in 2010 and that we're all in it together. So Mr. Osborne said that households on average would be £900 better off in 2015 than they were in 2010, yet Mr. Miliband in his reply to the speech claims that people are £1,600 a year worse off. So where does the truth lie? Well, before saying anything about the particular details, it is pretty straightforward to paint the broad picture. Average household incomes have just about regained their pre-recession levels. They're finally rising. They probably will be a bit higher in 2015 than they were in 2010. Possibly they'll be higher than their 2009 peak. But that still represents by far the slowest recovery in incomes in modern history. Having household incomes crawl back above their pre-recession levels 6 or 7 years after the recession hit really isn't any cause for celebration. But what's the difference between Mr. Osborne's £900 better off and Mr. Miliband's £1,600 worse off? Well, in part, the difference arises because Mr. Miliband is talking about gross earnings, not net incomes. The latter allows a fuller description of what's happening to household living standards. Earnings have fallen more than other incomes. Employment has risen, pensioners' incomes have risen, and measures of changes in gross earnings don't take account of the tax system. If you're a taxpayer and your gross pay falls by £1,600, then your net pay will fall by a maximum of £1,100. So they're one's looking at earnings, one's looking at incomes, one's looking at gross earnings, one's looking at net incomes. In addition, Mr. Miliband is using published figures up to April 2014 perfectly reasonably. Mr. Osborne is relying on forecasts through to the end of 2015, and all of the real increase since 2010 actually comes in the forecast rather than in the hard data about what's actually happened. The increase occurs in the last year in 2015. As ever, there's much truth in both numbers. Real earnings have fallen, as Mr. Miliband says. Real incomes should be above their 2010 level, as Mr. Osborne says. But we are for sure much worse off on average than we could reasonably have expected back in 2007, or indeed back in 2010. Mr. Osborne's second claim is that we're all in this together, that inequality has fallen. Mr. Miliband says it's a recovery for the few. So our analysis suggests three things. At least across the vast majority of household population, inequality has fallen a little, certainly if you assume everyone has faced the same rate of inflation. If you adjust for the fact that different households face slightly different changes in prices, then inequality now in 2014-15 is probably very similar to inequality in 2007-8. This has not been a period of rising inequality, but not a significant reduction either. The experience has been very different by age, much more variation by age than by income group. Average incomes among pensioners have risen. Among those of working age, they've fallen, with especially big falls for those in their 20s. This pattern has largely been driven by what's happened to earnings. And as far as tax and benefit changes are concerned, well, benefit cuts have hit low-income, working-age people. Tax increases have hit those of the very highest incomes much the hardest. Amazingly, remarkably, and Rob Joyce will go through this in a minute, tax increases have barely affected people on middle and upper middle incomes. They've been remarkably insulated from the tax and benefit changes. If you look at the changes over the period of the consolidation as a whole, starting in January 2010, then actually the richest have been hit hardest. But if you look only at the changes implemented by the coalition since April 2010, then the poorest have seen the biggest proportionate losses. Rob Joyce will go through all of that in considerably more detail in a minute. What about public finances and public spending? Well, the overall public finance numbers are hardly changed over the next few years by comparison with the autumn statement forecast. The deficit will be about 90 billion this year, about 3 times what Mr. Osborne intended back in 2010, reflecting, of course, the low growth in the early years of the Parliament, and the Chancellor's actually relatively flexible attitude to deficit reduction. It's worth being clear, though, the only realistic way in which he could have achieved a significantly lower deficit would have been by cutting spending more or raising taxes more. Mr. Osborne surprised many of us yesterday by announcing that, contrary to expectations and previous forecasts, he now expects to meet his old supplementary fiscal target of debt falling as a proportion of national income in 2015-16. How has he done this? By selling assets, largely shares in financial institutions bought as part of the financial sector bailout. Their sale, of course, makes no difference at all to for the overall public sector balance sheets. Other forecast changes slightly strengthen the public finances going forward, largely a result of lower forecast inflation, reducing expected spending on debt, interest and welfare. The Chancellor is looking to use some of that money, a bit, to slightly reduce public spending cuts in 2016-17 and 2017-18 compared with what he said in the autumn statement. But the big difference from the autumn statement lies in 2019-20. In what looks like a sharp change of tack, it's no longer his intention to keep cutting and create a £23 billion surplus. Rather, public service spending will be allowed to rise substantially. Gemma Tetlow will say a lot more about the public finances as soon as I sit down. But looking at the spending cuts over the next Parliament, I think one of the things that strikes me is that, in my mind at least, the path of those spending cuts is, if anything, more uncertain than before. That's partly because there are big differences between the parties, and those big differences still exist. We've always talked about the difference being between Labour looking for current budget balance and the Conservatives looking for budget balance, rather than the difference implied in the autumn statement. That's still a 25 or 30 billion difference between the parties. In fact, actually, our latest estimate suggests that Labour will be able to meet its fiscal targets, depending on exactly how it defines them, without any cuts at all after 2015-16, and Sir Mayor Keynes will explain why that is in a minute. But the budget suggests spending cuts of £40 billion by 2018, but £26 billion by 2019-20. The question is, even with a majority Conservative government, is that actually the path that we'll see? Will we really see sharp cuts and then sharp increases over the period of the next Parliament? I don't know. And there's the question of how much of that cut will come from public services. As I've said, the Chancellor argues that because he's committed to 12 billion of welfare cuts and 5 billion of tax avoidance measures, the required cuts to public service spending are much more modest. But as I said, if he really wants us to believe that, then he needs to be more explicit about how he actually thinks he can cut welfare spending and raise additional sums from clamping down on tax avoidance. And finally, don't forget there is a range of actually other hidden pressures on public spending. Look in table 2.2 of the Red Book, and the table shows the public finance effects of announced policies in previous budgets. You'll find a figure of 5 billion alongside a line saying contracting out of NICs. Now there's a mistake in the next two numbers. That's an extra 3.7 billion, not 5 billion, of NI contributions required from public sector employers. The 5 billion is from all employers. A bit of that comes from the private sector. 3.7 billion from the public sector, not the 5 billion written in what you've got there. That's a 3.7 billion reduction in spending power. There's another £1 billion required from public sector employers to pay for extra costs of public service pensions. And once again in this budget, the Chancellor has made some unfunded commitments. The help to buy ISA, for example, is not scored beyond next year. The extra money for mental health will be paid for extra unspecified cuts elsewhere. And that 1.5 billion, by the way, is 300 million a year, not 1.5 billion a year. I should advertise some IFS work on this, actually. We've done work on the impact of mental health of children on later outcomes, which does suggest that this is a good place to invest money. So the upshot of all this, well, my guess is that even under a majority Conservative government, annual cuts in public service spending won't turn out much more dramatic than we've seen over this Parliament in the first 2 years of the next. We won't probably be on the OBR's roller coaster. But it is a shame that despite all the massive information in the EFO, I am left guessing, actually. Whitehall departments are going to have to plan for some dramatically differing scenarios, one of which they'll have to implement in just 12 months' time. I won't say much about tax changes. The Chancellor has spent an awful lot of money increasing the income tax personal allowance, reducing fuel duties, cutting rates of corporation tax, and again yesterday he spent more on the first two of those. But the big structural reforms have come in the taxation of pensions and savings. We saw some additional changes yesterday. A further reduction in the amount that can be saved free of income tax in a pension is actually a further erosion of a rather sensible part of the tax system, allowing people to save from pre-tax income and pay tax on withdrawal. And while a reduction in the lifetime limit is less problematic than reductions in annual limits and rates of relief, there are better ways to reduce tax relief for pensions, in particular reducing the extraordinarily generous treatment of employer contributions by the national insurance system. The proposed change to the tax system will allow people to cash in their annuities looks in principle like a sensible move, certainly a logical progression on what was announced last year in terms of not forcing people to take in annuities. But what effect it will actually have in practice, I think, is much less clear. Allowing a market to exist doesn't mean that it will exist. There's a classic adverse selection problem here. Who's most likely to want to cash in their annuity? Someone who now knows, which they didn't when they bought their annuity, that they may not have long to live. How much will they get for their annuity? Not much. What might annuity companies reasonably assume about anyone wanting to cash in? That they've reason to believe, they themselves, they won't live so long. How much will they get paid for their annuity? Not much. This is a market which suffers, or potentially suffers, a classic adverse selection problem. Whether this tax change will make a big difference, I don't know. Finally, it's worth saying that adding flexibility to ISAs, taking most of interest income out of tax altogether, is a further welcome simplification of the taxation of savings. So, as expected, this last budget of this Parliament didn't usher in any dramatic changes. Chancellor Osborne has resisted the temptation to offer lots of pre-election goodies. Whoever's Chancellor after the election will be left with plenty of work still to do.